Okay, juniors, we're going to quickly wrap up the American Revolution here. So, what we had talked previously about in class is we had discussed the American Revolutionary War here, kind of in a chronological order, starting all the way back in June 1775 with our first major battle of the American Revolutionary War in the Battle of Bunker Hill, fought outside Boston, going through the winter of 1776 into 1777, and wrapping up with our Battle of Saratoga here in October of 1777, which again is the turning point in the American Revolutionary War for the colonists. Again, to this point, they had been defeated by a more well organized, more well equipped British army. However, after the Battle of Saratoga, this huge colonial victory, it's a turning point in the war because it's after this point where the French will actually step in and help the colonists and formally align themselves with the colonies in the effort to defeat Britain. Again, the French had some political interest in this as well, as they had lost to Britain during the French and Indian War and lost many of their land holdings in North America. So ultimately, getting into the conclusion of the American Revolutionary War, we had focused mostly on kind of the fighting in the northern colonies. Again, the independence movement in the northern colonies was a little stronger, I guess you might say, than it was in the South. Again, a lot of that kind of goes back to how correspondence and such was spread in the North, and the events in Boston and the surrounding areas. But anyways, talking about the South, the British general in the South to be aware of, the key leader there is General Charles Cornwallis. He is kind of viewed as like the George Washington of the British Army, kind of like their head figurehead, the quote unquote their best general. And Cornwallis thought that the war in the South would go really well for the British because there was a high loyalist population in the South. Loyalists were the colonists who remained loyal to Britain throughout the Revolutionary War. And due to the fact that there was a high population in the South of these loyalists, Cornwallis thought he'd be able to, better supply his army, have a tactical advantage in the sense that they wouldn't be fighting a strong kind of like independent type, patriot, I guess, what you'd see in the North, where you had the majority of the population that was all about independence. And what does end up happening is the fighting in the South becomes very brutal because of the terrain was different, the style of fighting was different. You have guys like Francis Marion, who is a colonist who fought for the Continental Army, and some of the tactics he's going to use in that were less traditional. Okay, again, at this point, American Revolutionary War, war would tend to be fought in lines where two lines of troops would shoot at each other. Francis Marion kind of changes that for the Continental Army and would use more of the guerrilla kind of sneak attacks, things that were less traditional. And for some of those reasons, the fighting in the South becomes much more brutal than it was in the North. Kind of skipping some of those battles, Cornwallis is going to win some, but eventually, I guess what you should know is he is successful enough in the South to move north into Virginia. And it's going to be in October of 1781 where a Cornwallis army and a George Washington and Horatio Gates army are going to square off. The French are going to come and save the day for the colonists, and the Continental Army, I should say, and use their strong navy to prevent the British from resupplying in Virginia as they march north. And ultimately, this is going to be where Cornwallis surrenders to George Washington, and this is the final battle of the American Revolutionary War in October of 1781. Just kind of the way it turned out. And again, the French were huge in this and using their mighty navy to blockade the coast and preventing the British from resupplying. And Cornwallis will be forced to surrender to George Washington. So flashing forward 2 years later, so there is some minor fighting that I guess continues in the colonies, quote unquote. But for the most part, the major conflicts are over. So in 1783, there's going to be a call for a peace convention in the city of Paris, and the United States, I suppose you could say now, is going to send guys like Benjamin Franklin over to negotiate peace. And eventually what comes out of this is the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Now, what's really interesting is following the war is Britain still did not want to recognize independence of the colonies. France and Spain were also at the same peace convention, and before the Americans would discuss anything relating to land holdings or anything else, they basically said, you have to recognize our independence, Britain. That's the only way we're doing this. That's the only way we're even willing to meet about a peace treaty. And that was like the first and foremost thing. And so Britain agrees to recognize the independence of the United States. So after that, there is going to be a border established between the colonies and Canada. Canada's going to get returned to France. They're going to use the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Well, I guess parts of Canada get returned to France, like i.e. Quebec. But the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, the northern boundary of the Mississippi River, will be the border between the United States and Canada, or I know colonies is what I have here in the notes. The Mississippi River will be the western border between the United States and Spain. Spain will control everything west of the Mississippi River. Florida also gets returned to Spain that they had lost to the British during the French and Indian War. And then number 5, which is really interesting, is Great Britain agrees to withdraw troops from North America, or from what is now the United States. And why that one is starred and why it is blue is because they don't actually do that. They leave a lot of their troops in the western part, I guess, so around the Mississippi River and Great Lakes area. And that is something that's going to lead to another war with Britain about 30 years from this time. Okay, so keep that in mind. Keep that in the back of your head. As the British say, yes, you are independent. We recognize you are your own independent nation. However, they never withdraw their troops. In time, that leads to a lot of issues. And we're going to see a quote unquote a second war of independence fought between the British and the United States in the early 1800s, in the War of 1812, as it becomes known as. So keep that in the back of your minds here as we wrap this up. The other thing the British asked for is that the rights and the property be restored to loyalists. So colonists that did not fight on the side of the Continental Army during the war, the loyalists, we talked about them, that they have their quote unquote their rights and their property restored, and the United States is kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. And that's pretty much it. But the big one here is independence of the United States. We have some of the political land holdings figured out by the Europeans. And then number 5 here on the list, keep that in the back of your mind, is that Great Britain says they will pull all their troops out of what is now the United States. They never really do. And that's going to lead to a second war, quote unquote, of independence about 30 years from now. As far as other effects, again, you're going to see the United States develop as its own country. That sense of patriotism and the pride in the country. Right towards the end of the war, the Second Continental Congress is going to adopt our first written set, or our first written structure of government, what we had in the United States, known as the Articles of Confederation. We're going to see a gradual, quote-unquote, expansion of rights, especially voting rights. Again, I use that kind of loosely because, again, most people in the United States did not actually have the right to vote. But we'll get to that. And then, again, this indirectly is going to lead to some interesting relationships with foreign nations, i.e. France and Britain. They're going to still kind of compete over an alliance for the United States. And this is something that's also going to lead to a second war of independence in the War of 1812. All right, so keep those things in mind here as we wrap up our American Revolutionary War. I will post a Kahoot here so that you can review for your test as well.